Thanks for joining us today on what is another beautiful day in Toronto. We're here to talk about blockchain. My name is Baer. I'm here with my colleague, Don Johnston. A little bit about me. I'm an associate in our firm's corporate commercial group, doing a lot of work on M&A deals, transactions, and contracts for businesses. I'm also heavily involved in our legal technology initiatives as we work to transform the way we serve our clients. Along with Don, I'm the co-leader of our firm's blockchain, cryptocurrency, and ICOs group.
Morning, I'm Don Johnston. Great to be here. Aaron kind of lied about the weather today. It's a horrible day in Toronto and raining. My hair's going all frizzy. It's really terrible. So first of all, we have a confession to make, and that is that we said this is about blockchain. Yes, it's about blockchain, but really what we wanted to talk about was distributed ledger technology in a more general sense, and you'll get an idea of what that is as we go through it. Blockchain is one of those kinds of distributed ledger technologies, and as you see from the slide, the blockchain is one of many kinds. There are all kinds of distributed ledger technologies, and the blockchain, just one of them. Bitcoin is not equal to blockchain. Blockchain is not equal to Bitcoin. Bitcoin's enabled by this blockchain technology. I feel, and maybe Aaron, you might disagree with this, but I feel that blockchain is probably not the best form of distributed ledger technology for a bunch of reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later.
But it is certainly the best known one, and there's no doubt that there's plenty of confusion. I had a relative ask me a few months ago if they could buy blockchain, so that was clearly something they can't purchase. But certainly when we hear people talk about blockchain, what they really mean is distributed ledger technology. Blockchain just happens to be, as Don mentioned, by far the best known one.
So maybe the best way to start would be to contrast distributed ledger technology with centralized ledgers. One of the questions we got even at the beginning of this was, can you compare blockchain to ERP and or distributed SQL? Essentially, blockchain or distributed ledger technology is exactly as the name implies. It's not centralized. And the traditional kinds of centralized ledgers that we're used to really are the ones that have been around for ages. It's the one that is at your hospital. Your bank has one. Probably the place you work has a central ledger of everything. You trust it, but probably just because you have to, Aaron?
And I think we've seen some examples recently where we trust these things until suddenly we can't trust them anymore. And when there's a problem, suddenly people say, well, why is it that they had so much information? How did we let this happen? And of course, that's how we've always done it.
That's right. Well, these distributed ledgers are a little bit like logs of events, entries, if you will, in a system. They're not necessarily or primarily a summary, although of course, you can get a summary or create a summary from different kinds. But the essence of it is that everybody or anybody can have a copy. And so that's essentially what makes it difficult to hack. So the example we give in the slide is, look, imagine there's a history of Canada in a book and everybody has a copy of the book. If you want to kind of rewrite Canadian history, to tell the truth about certain things that might have happened in the past, you'd have to actually recover every copy of the book, replace it with a new book, and then people would refer to the new book as the definitive source. You'd have to sneak the old book away from them so they wouldn't know that it had been switched, and it just wouldn't work. Well, that book is like a distributed ledger.
So is a distributed ledger then, Don, something that's new? Or is a distributed ledger something we've sort of had before, but now we're seeing new ways of applying technology to make it more valuable?
Well, the issue really has to do with the checking, because let's say that you've got a copy of a book and I've got a copy of a book. We have a high degree of confidence that they're the same. But I look in my book and it says edition 5, and yours says edition 4. Maybe mine's a little bit different. How's it different? We don't know. Can you check? I don't know. Do you feel like it? No, you don't. So the issue with distributed ledgers, which of course have existed as books since forever, is that they're not self-checking. On the other hand, distributed ledger technology is self-checking. You can determine through the exercise of the functionality of these distributed ledger software what, if it really does comply.
And one example I like to use, a really low-tech, easy example is, imagine you're hosting a poker game at your house, and, I've invited Don and 2 other people. And there's at least one person there that's not trustworthy. And it turns out I forgot the poker chips. I left them at work. And the question becomes, if you're playing for $10, you're probably not too fussed. But let's pretend there's $1 million on the line, and I've got 2 trustworthy people, and Don is the 3rd trustworthy person, of course, who's with me, and we need to keep score of this game.
You lose.
So how do we do that? Do I just let Don himself keep score, and then Don might say at the end, "Oh, I won," and he just won $1 million. So do I trust Don on his own? Do I hire a third person? Do I hire a friend of mine or a neutral third party, someone that none of us know, to keep score and trust them? Or maybe there's an alternative, and maybe in this case we all decide to keep score, and after every single bet, after every single hand, we're constantly checking back and forth with everyone at the table to make sure that we all have the exact same number of chips per se that we have, because if we're not doing that, we could have a problem.
That's what the banks do, isn't it? They all check each other at the end of every day, and they swap, they settle up, right?
Exactly.
And the central bank watches to make sure they do it right.
So distributed ledger technology, or distributed ledgers themselves, are not new. What's new is what we can do with them and how we can build trust.
Well, that's it. What you're talking about, what is sort of at the root of trust is consensus, and you can't have that consensus, how many points did you win in the poker game? You can't have that without trust. Whether the trust is in a distributed ledger, whether it's in a trustworthy person, whether it's everybody keeps track of their own, whatever it is, that's how you get consensus. And when you don't get consensus, then you have litigation or gunfire. But that's very, very important. Without any kind of trust, you can't have business.
In trust, we pay a price for trust. There's no doubt about that. In countries where their legal systems are less developed, or when you're looking at a new relationship with a third party who you've never dealt with before, there's a lot of due diligence that's going on, and that trust has huge costs, both time and resources.
Yeah,
so the question is, can I get to that point of trusting the other party faster? And in particular, if I don't even know who that other party is, how can I possibly trust them?
That's right. Well, distributed ledger technology basically gives you consensus on the basis that you trust the system, you trust the technology, rather than any particular party. And of course, you can only trust technology to the extent that you demonstrate over and over again that it actually does work and give you the same result every time. And it has to be open to testing. So we trust all kinds of technology, sometimes to our detriment. But the distributed ledger technology is one where anybody can check, and in fact, everybody does check through the use of software routines that ascertain that the information you're looking at in your distributed ledger is in fact up to date and correct. Interestingly, in any other kind of system, if your poker game were a game of 50 or 60 people, that's just more opportunities for mistrust.
And if you take the poker example to the online sphere, you're playing poker or some other gambling game online. How do I know that online website has fair odds? How do I know that the cards are being dealt evenly in a game of blackjack and that the house is not winning more than they should be?
How do you know you're not the only human being in the game?
Exactly. We trust.
Yes.
We go to a casino in person, we trust them. We play online, we trust them. And often we haven't really thought about, well, what happens if this isn't the case? What happens if we really shouldn't be trusting them? And what distributed ledger technology is letting us do is saying, maybe there's an alternative here. Maybe I shouldn't have been so trustworthy in the first place, but maybe there's a much better way to do some of these things.
Yeah, and the nice thing about distributed ledger technology in terms of trust is that the one issue that it solves, well, it solves a number, but one issue it does solve is that there's no single point of failure. With a central ledger, if that one goes down, and we see that from time to time with banks and whatnot, you can't get at your money. You can't find out what your balance is. You can't transfer any money and so forth. That's not the case with distributed ledger systems. Of course, if your own computer goes down, well, you're out of luck. Get a coffee, relax.
Exactly. So one thing, obviously, that we use currently, without distributed ledger technology, is laws. Laws to keep people honest. Laws to keep people complying with their obligations. So, for example, you might have an obligation to promptly notify the bank or your counterparty if a certain event happens. And if you fail to do that, well, there's a remedy. Mm-hmm. But there's nothing really currently that's automatically notifying that counterparty if a certain event happens. You might have an obligation to tell them, and there might be a remedy, but there's a disconnect there between what you're not allowed to do and what you actually do. And maybe there's a way, Don, with blockchain that we can sort of help get a step closer to that happening automatically.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I can't totally agree with what you said. There are some examples of where a system will tell you when something's gone wrong. But for the most part, it's true. We rely on human intervention a lot in our current system. So one of the things that we get is what is a blockchain? And in fact, somebody posed that very question while signing up. What is a blockchain? I'm confused. And welcome to the club. And I was confused when I first started looking at it too. The biggest issue that I had was the idea that everybody and anybody can have a copy, and that's actually the thing that most people get stuck on. Is where is the system? Where is this distributed ledger? Well, it's everywhere. So blockchain gets its name from being a chain of blocks, for which I deeply apologize.
It's the most sincere apology I've ever heard you make, Tom.
Okay, not really, but I'm a lawyer. Anyway, so a block is a block of data. It's been put together. It's been hashed. I don't want to get into what that's all about. But what happens is that blocks are proven to be correct using a certain process called mining, which is also very confusing. Once a block is proven to be correct using this process, it's added to other blocks, very long chain of blocks, in fact, and it becomes part of that chain. Once it's attached to the chain, it's there forever. And somebody asked a question about the GDPR, the new
European privacy regulation coming into effect, I believe, a month from today. So
yeah, that's right, May 25th. And one of the interesting requirements of that regulation is that everybody has the right to be forgotten. Right?
So that sounds like a problem, Don, because I've been told that blockchain is largely immutable, meaning it can't be changed, and yet you're telling me I have the right to be forgotten, which presumably means my data needs to be changed.
Aaron, I'll never forget you. But the issue is that there is a disconnect. Now, it may be that the European privacy commissioners will come out and say, look, because it's anonymous, and that's something that we have to discuss in a moment. Because the information on a blockchain is at least anonymous, maybe it's not personal data within the meaning of the regulation, and so it's not an issue. I don't know what they're going to say, but and maybe some of the listeners out there have an idea about that. John Wunderlich, I'm referring to you. But I think that that kind of thing is an issue. If you take a look at let's say Ontario's Personal Health Information Protection Act, it anticipates, just as most other privacy laws anticipate, that there's a person controlling the data. Somebody's in charge. Well, who's in charge with the distributed ledger?
Who do I blame? Who do I contact to get my information back? Who do I blame if there's a problem?
Yeah.
What happens if there's an issue in some coding on a certain kind of contract? We had some questions coming in. Blockchain is confusing. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this. Any good books, any good things you can recommend? A couple suggestions. There's a great book called The Business Blockchain. I think it's a really helpful way to sort of understand blockchain as a basis, but also understand some applications to business. It does a great job of walking you through how you can apply it. It does presume maybe a little bit, it's meant for a mainstream audience, but it does presume a little bit of an understanding about blockchain. If you want to learn more, you might want to start online. Tons of phenomenal YouTube videos, lots on Wikipedia or on a CoinDesk or on Reddit or other sites like that. There are huge communities with information, and we're happy to send some suggestions to you. So if you're interested, just send Don or I an email after this webinar is done, and we're happy to recommend a few options to guide you in the right direction.
So, are distributed ledger technologies better than the old-fashioned kind? The answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no. For one thing, a distributed ledger is really difficult to censor, simply because once the information is on there, it's on there, and thanks to cryptographic science, it really can't be dislodged. So, difficult to censor. It's difficult to be dishonest in ways that we can't really explain right now.
But certainly not perfect. I don't think anyone here is. No, I think sometimes we hear people say, blockchain is fully immutable, or blockchain is, it solves all these problems entirely. And I think it's fair to say, Don, that's not 100% true. There are possibilities in theory where bad actors, if they gain control of the network, could, in theory, change information. Is that accurate?
There's something called a 51% attack that is possible. And if you take a look now, for example, take a look around the world at where all the blockchain mining is going on. There's a very, very significant amount of it going on in one particular country. I don't want to say which country that is now, but its initials are China. And so it's possible. And I don't say this, and I have no reason to believe that Chinese miners are any different from anybody else. But it's possible that a 51% attack could on the Bitcoin blockchain could be launched from China. That could shift. Nobody really knows. It's a theoretical thing.
Theoretical, but just to confirm, again, it's not. These are not 100% foolproof systems, and I think often they're presented that way. They're presented as this is a solution to everything. Any business problem can be solved by blockchain or DLT, and they're perfect in all these ways, and that's definitely not the case. There's a lot of benefits of DLT, but they're also, you need to be using them in the right circumstances, which we can talk about after, and need to understand that there are imperfections in every system. One great thing about DLT is it can't be lost or misplaced. So if you think about traditional storage of records, let's use a law firm as an example. Law firms traditionally, very paper-based, obviously a lot more digital these days. But imagine, or even a normal company, imagine you've got a contract from 1930, and a party is saying, no, I know this was the contract. I have a copy of it, and it's on this very old piece of paper. It's looking as whether it is Don's face. And
that's pretty old.
Yeah. That is pretty old. And you say, well, yeah, here's the contract. I present it to Don and say, no, you need to pay me $1 million. It says right here that in the year 2018, you owe me $1 million. And Don says, I have no idea what you're talking about. This isn't a contract. You might have made this up. So how do I know that was a real contract? What would have happened if I had lost that piece of paper in the first place? You've got a problem, and you've got so much business these days still being transacted. You look at shipping or supply chains and things like that. You might have a mixture of email, of faxes, of phone calls, stuff all over the place, all sorts of different media. And how do you know what the deal was, what the terms were, and how do you reconcile that? And that's sort of, we've ignored it.
That's how litigators make money, though. And which, by the way, for all you litigators out there who are listening, I'm not against that. I like that.
We call that cross-selling here, Don.
Yes, cross-selling. That's exactly right. The thing is that the way courts will resolve decisions or arguments like that is by looking at evidence and giving certain weight to it, right? So some weight will be assigned to every bit of evidence. Sometimes it's zero, and sometimes it's conclusive, and there's all the range in between. That's why reasonable people can still disagree on stuff, right? Because they assign different weights of evidence to various kinds of evidence. With distributed ledger technology, that's more difficult. I don't know. Maybe I'm not enough of a propeller head, but I think that there's an almost religious zeal that you get in particularly in the blockchain community the Bitcoin community about the efficacy of Bitcoin and blockchain mining and that sort of thing. And I get it. I understand that people can literally fall in love with it and find it fascinating. It is fascinating, but love can make you blind, Aaron. That's just from one old weathered guy to a young guy. And so the issue is that you can believe that blockchain technology is absolutely correct, and you can sometimes be wrong about it. It's entirely possible. So let's talk a little bit about scaling. I think it's probably the biggest issue with blockchains.
When we talk about scaling, are we talking really just the number of transactions as we see people moving towards using blockchain and DLT solutions a lot more? Is that what we're talking about when we say scaling?
Look, that's right. I mean, the problem that I see with blockchains, especially the public blockchains that rely on mining, which we still haven't talked about. Don't worry, we'll get there. Is that the more successful it is, the more likely it is to collapse. There's some what's called network economics. One of the basic rules of network economics is that the more that a network is utilized, generally speaking, the more valuable it becomes, until a certain point. That point is the point of congestion. So anybody who's trying to make it into the office this morning but is stuck out on the street understands about network congestion. Our roads are a network. When they get congested, they become less valuable. Not to just that one last person who is the straw that broke the camel's back in the traffic jam, but everybody who's stuck there. The people who came early, the people who have to run out in the middle of the day and get into the traffic jam. So that's congestion issue. Blockchains of the Bitcoin variety have that scaling issue. The more they become used, the more electricity is required to operate them. And the more likely it is that they will essentially collapse under their own weight. And it's one of the worries that I have about Bitcoin. Right now, Bitcoin is a very, very small percentage of all the, let's say, money in the broadest possible sense. All the money transactions that occur in the world, Bitcoin is a very, very small
Absolutely.
amount. It's like less than 1% probably. So with that level of use, it still works. Hasn't collapsed. It still costs a fortune to send any kind of a payment.
Certainly, you're not going to be sending a micropayment using Bitcoin,
No.
especially not a few months ago when the transaction fees were even higher.
Yeah.
So why are some of these alternatives to blockchain possibly likely to be more successful? So one thing we talk about is proof of work, which for a while was this main way of achieving consensus. And the idea is that these miners, and we'll get there a little bit more in a second, have to solve these cryptographic challenges in order to validate certain information and add a new block to the chain. Mm-hmm. So you've got your genesis block, your first block on the chain, and then when new information comes on, the real question, of course, is how do we trust that information? How do I have that consensus? And a new block needs to get added, and we'll get there. But proof of work is all this effort that these miners have to go through, and it's deliberate, but it makes the system slower. And the reason it's deliberate is if it was really easy to modify a block, I could go back through that whole history of Canada or that whole entire poker summary of the scores and modify it and edit my whole blockchain really quickly. So by requiring you to do all this work to modify it, it's making it very challenging, especially as these chains grow and grow and grow, where it's practically going to be impossible for you to be able to go back, modify it, and bring it all forward.
Sure. It's cheaper to knock off a 7-Eleven than it is to make money that way. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the flaws is that it's been designed to be slow and difficult. So that you have to say, wait a second, is that really a good thing? The other thing about, I think maybe it's time to talk about this mining concept before we move on to these alternatives. The way that mining works, and we'll say more later when we get into the Bitcoin thing. But the way mining works is that there's a puzzle that these miners have to solve, and in the simplest possible terms, what you do is guess a number. You've played that game. Guess a number between 1 and 10. And,
it's always a decimal.
Yeah.
It's always a always a trick.
That's right. Well, the number that you have to guess is a crazy number, if you apply that number to the puzzle, in other words, you actually apply a cryptographic function to that number, and you get an answer. If the answer has enough leading zeros, let's say, if the answer looks like the answer you're looking for, then there's a high degree of probability that the number you guessed is the right number. Well, the way mining is you just keep guessing over and over again. So you have these computers, special purpose computers, that use all kinds of electricity. And I mean, when I say all kinds, I mean enough to run a country, literally. Denmark has been used as an example from time to time. So you burn electricity guessing numbers. And if you're successful in guessing the number, you win.
You get a prize.
You get a prize, and that's why people do it. And the prize is currently 12.5 bitcoins. Now, later on, it'll be 6.25 bitcoins, but at the moment, it's 12.5 bitcoins, and that's
a sizable amount of money. That's over $100,000 there, I believe.
Yep. But you have to burn a lot of electricity to do that, and so that means you have to have lots of computers working away.
To use a different example, I mean, Don's described that perfectly. Let's pretend, I give 10 people the same gym lock. You've got a lock and you've got 3 different numbers. You've got to twist it twice, clockwise and then back counterclockwise and back the other way. And the first person to figure out what that combination on the gym lock is going to get a prize. And you're going to know that you've got the right answer.
Yeah, you get your dirty sneakers. That's all you get. Come
Absolutely. And when you've got the right answer, obviously, when that lock opens, right? So as soon as the lock opens, I know I've solved the puzzle. And all you've done is hand 10 people the exact same lock and said, go. You don't know where to start. So you might start, 1, 2, 3, that's not working, 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 5. You can go through all your possible permutations. And that's really what they're doing. They're guessing. You know when you have the right answer, what that answer is, or how to get there, I should say. We don't know.
Yeah. What's the value of all the wrong numbers that you dialed in on your combination lock? Stumped you.
Stumped me.
Good. The value. There are really only two value. Well,
Oh,
you might
open
have
and close,
burned
I
it.
guess,
You might have
then.
burned some calories. So that's a good thing. You strengthen your fingers. I don't know. But essentially, the value of the wrong numbers is that they're not the right one.
Correct.
And so you keep track of all the wrong numbers until you eventually get the right number. The puzzle that you're solving by guessing this number is that's expensive. That's a lot of electricity to burn. I don't know what the margins look like for mining. I imagine it's still pretty good.
And there's a reason. Just like people jurisdiction shop for their contracts. People are, as I think many people are well aware, doing the same thing for their Bitcoin mining or their cryptocurrency mining. So
Sure.
where to set up shop, whether it's in Quebec or Ontario, or in Iceland or other places around the world, you're going to have massive differences in your costs just simply because of the amount of electricity that's being used.
Plattsburgh, New York, actually is in the news these days. The Plattsburgh's located on the northern border of New York State. Shout out to Plattsburgh, and the electricity there is pretty inexpensive. So Plattsburgh has some Bitcoin mining going on there, significant amount. And what they've found is that it uses up so much electricity that, and by the way, without necessarily generating a lot of employment, that was the carrot, right? But they didn't really employ as many people as was expected. But they burned so much electricity that the local residents have had to pay extra money when there's a surge
So
to heat their houses and stuff. Right?
The locals are subsidizing the miners.
Yeah, and they're not necessarily happy about that. But as you say, there are jurisdictions where there's lots of excess capacity. China being one of them. There's a lot of oil being burned over there, but they're generating lots of electricity, and they do quite well. Iceland, I think, has a pretty good electrical grid simply because they use. Oh, wait a second. There's one of our phones just said something.
Hopefully looking for other opportunities to mine.
I love it when that happens. Iceland is cheap. They've got geothermal, and there are other places that are cheap. Quebec has got
certainly
great,
cheaper than Ontario right now. That's for sure. So if we jump back, so a distributed ledger traditionally is a public ledger. All transactions are open for everybody to see, which you think might have some privacy concerns, which may or may not be the case. But you might think, oh, well, if everyone can see what I'm doing, isn't this a problem? You're going to see my name, Aaron Baer. I just sent 5 Bitcoins to Don. That sounds like a problem, but that's not actually what's happening in most cases. No. And what's really happening is, there's an ID that's, my public wallet ID associated with me. So, for example, you know where I live, you know my address, and you might know every transaction that I've done. But you don't know who I am. But that doesn't necessarily make it impossible to figure out who I am.
You can apply big data technology to figure out stuff about people by not just by looking at a distributed ledger. You can find out about who people are by putting together various databases and learn stuff. And this is exactly what's happening. The view has been expressed that the open ledger, the distributed ledger, is actually a gift to law enforcement, and that it's an ideal sort of way to find out what's going on. If I know, for example, that you've just moved an exact number of bitcoins from point A to point B, I can look for that transaction and know that it's you. Then I can go back in the ledger and essentially look at everything you've done.
And if that ledger is there, that means you may not have to go to, for example, to a bank and get a court order to access that information. That information is there, and if you can't be changing it, that could be accessed years later, once technology catches up and once the appropriate authorities are getting some information.
Exactly.
So Bitcoin we talked about a bit. We're going to head back there now. So Bitcoin was really the first use case for the demonstration of distributed ledger technology. And Bitcoin, I think, I hesitate to use the word mainstream because depending on what world you operate in, mainstream means very different things. If you're my grandmother, that was back in December or January when she asked me if she should buy cryptocurrencies, and my risk-averse fiance, who, despite having to be convinced to purchase normal equities, suddenly said, should I be buying Bitcoin? And of course, that was at the peak of the bubble.
Wait. This is the woman who's going to marry you?
That's what she thinks, at
and
least.
And she's risk-averse?
Risk-averse. And not a lawyer. Think of that.
Okay.
But Bitcoin isn't new. That's the interesting thing. People think Bitcoin is new. Maybe they just heard about it in the last week, month, year. Bitcoin was the first white paper on Bitcoin, or the first white paper, was published October 31st, 2008. So we're in 2018 right now. We're talking almost a 10-year-old technology. Certainly did not gain widespread knowledge. Certainly did not gain widespread adoption for a lot of time. But when we think about Bitcoin, a lot of people think, oh, this is new technology, and that's not actually true.
It's not really true. No. In fact, you can get a university degree now in cryptocurrencies that essentially digs right into blockchain technology. It's been developed over years, and they've been teaching it for years. It's more or less mainstream in a restricted sense. So we got some interesting questions here, by the way.
Yeah, let's tackle some of those.
Maybe we should just take a look at them. Yeah.
So maybe we'll start with one. Someone asked, if one of these copies of this distributed ledger gets hacked, would the hackers have all the information in that book, or I guess in that ledger? And I guess the first thing to start with is there's two different kinds of distributed ledgers, I guess. You've got the public ones and the private or the permissioned. Mm-hmm. So a public blockchain or a public ledger is available to anybody. If you want to download the appropriate client software, you can have access to that ledger. And that's the whole point. Anyone can have access to that on a public blockchain, which makes it a lot harder to change and allows you to keep track of all the information. So there really isn't hacking so much in terms of getting access to information, because on a public blockchain, the intent is that everyone can have access to it. On a private blockchain or distributed ledger, Don, that's going to be a little bit different.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Private blockchains are in a way simply a different form of access. If you look, for example, at the Port of Antwerp, I often cite that as a use case. Port of Antwerp has been using blockchain now for quite a while to sort of be the backbone of the operation of the port. So if you think about what happens at a port, people bring in materials by boat or by rail, depending on which way whether it's outbound or inbound goods. Those goods have an identification. They come on a specific vehicle, either a boat or a train. There's a container number associated with it. The goods are of a certain class. They have to be picked up at a certain time, delivered to a certain location, and so on and so on. And so the port initiated a blockchain for that particular purpose in order to enable all the players, if you will, the consignors, the consignees, the truck drivers, the ship operators, the crane operators, all those people at the port, they now can coordinate what they're doing and move goods through more quickly thanks to the blockchain. But
and they've got a record of what happened.
They have a record that's available, but it's only open to those players. And in fact, it's also anonymous in the sense that if you're a player who is interested in cargo number such and such contained in container whatever, you'll understand everything about that, but you don't understand everything about all the other stuff that's going on. Nevertheless, it's coordinated, it's elegant, works very well, but it's private. And there's a single sponsor of it, and that's the port itself. The chain is distributed, but it's distributed among a specific group. And, of course, it's self-auditing, which is very nice, and that helps move things along quite well. And I understand the customs people are pretty happy about it because it gives them a terrific ledger for determining the payment of duties and customs and keeping track of things. So let's see what else we've got. Somebody says here, how is this technology sane to use when there are so many frauds on the Bitcoin side that rides on blockchain technology? Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question. Ordinary money has been used for frauds.
Never
forever.
seen problems with ordinary money.
No. I think that the biggest risks in connection with cryptocurrencies have to do with their underlying value, if you have the underlying value of a currency is based on how many successful ransomware deals you've made or how many good drug deals you've made, yes, that gives you an underlying value, but is that something that you want to participate in? And if things go bad in the ransom business, how's that going to affect the value?
And certainly we've seen in the ICO, the initial coin offering space, we've seen plenty of fraud. There is no doubt about that. And we've seen, whether it's people coming up with grandiose ideas that sound incredible, and of course, very hard for the average person, ourselves included, to say, well, this is possible, this is impossible. They've got what looks like a good team of people, but then they collect, they raise $50 million. There's all sorts of online marketing, and there's all sorts of bots and people being paid to promote it on various forums. And it turns out that, you sent them all your money, and they ran away with it. They've taken the money, and there's really nothing to do. And, of course, the question is, who were they? Who are they, and what to do about that? So let's move along to talk maybe about some uses for blockchain. We can always come back to some of this stuff after. So
I do want to get back to alternatives, though,
sure,
to blockchain. Not now, but please don't let me forget, because, as you know, I am old, and that could happen.
So what's the point of a blockchain or distributed ledger technology? And I think one thing, again, number of friends of mine who are active in this space, and they'll be at meetings, they'll be working with companies, and the companies will have called them in because they're experts in designing these systems. And they'll be having this meeting, and they'll start talking, and it becomes quite apparent. No one's quite sure what they wanted a blockchain for, what it can do, and why it's needed to solve the problem that they're trying to solve.
Well, but it's cool.
But it is cool, and it sounds trendy, and it sounds like you're doing something, and you're being innovative. So what are some examples of where you could use blockchain? So one is smart contracts. We'll talk about momentarily. Share ownership. So in Delaware, you can record your ownership of shares on the blockchain.
Well, what's more interesting, though, than ownership is you can actually effect a transfer of shares. So if this catches on, it's not necessarily good for brokers, right? Because they make money by effecting transfers.
Right. There's the 3 Ds of blockchain. There's the decentralization, so taking away that third party whether from being involved. There's the distribution or distributed, so that ledger is everyone has available. And there's the disintermediation, and it's that intermediary, that person who's playing a role currently, where we're certainly ripe for disruption. I think blockchain has the potential where to potentially take away some of that work that they would be doing.
That's right. I mean, if you look at, especially just going back to the Delaware example, how shares are voted in annual general meetings. Right now, vast majority of shares are held in the possession and name of brokers. So if anybody's voting, it's probably them, right? And they'll submit their proxies, or maybe they don't vote at all. But you know, there's this kind of distance. There's a gulf between the actual owner of the shares and the company, and you know, to be able to vote at an annual general meeting is not necessarily an easy thing to do. Well, if shares can be held on a chain, the way Delaware is suggesting, perhaps that will improve the level of democracy or activity, at least, by ordinary shareholders. Maybe they'll start showing up at annual general meetings, and I'm not saying that's a wonderful thing, but I'm just saying that could be a change that could happen, and it may or may not be welcomed by everybody.
For sure, and you know, in the private company side, for example, you know, transferring shares is not something you do as simply as in the public space, and there are often restrictions on who can transfer the shares. It could be through a shareholders agreement, it could be through various securities law rules, and you know, you're seeing a lot now. Security tokens and securitization on the blockchain. So the creation of tokens to represent these pieces of paper effectively that we normally look at as shares. And with that, you can program into that various restrictions. You know, you can only transfer this to somebody who lives in a certain country because there's rules on it can only be held by a certain person. Yep. You can't transfer this in the first 4 months. And you can build these rules into the tokens, and that's really interesting because it allows for all sorts of interesting ways to transact. With fewer clearing, back office clearing, time to clear, and a lot of transactional costs that go on behind the scenes that we don't really think about.
It's pretty interesting stuff. The Payments Canada, the Bank of Canada, and a bunch of Canadian banks have been involved in something called Project Jasper for a while, and we have in Canada something called the Large Volume Transfer System that helps banks settle up at the end of every day. And so what they did was they kind of ran a parallel chain. I think they created a token called the Can Coin or something. No, you can't have one. It was a private chain. But anyway, the idea was that they ran this in parallel with the large volume transfer system, and it worked quite well. I'm not sure the banks were crazy about how much the other bank could see about what was going on, you know, behind the scenes. But banks will share certain information, but they don't like to have an open kimono approach to their business, and understandably so.
And I guess that's a challenge when you have a small number of players in a private blockchain, and they're all in the same line of business. And if you're not involved in a transaction, it's not necessarily that challenging to figure out.
Well, that's
who might have been involved.
That's right. I mean, I think Payments Canada has maybe 60 odd participants, you know, in their transfer system. So, you know, you could figure out what's going on pretty easily, especially with the biggest players. There are other uses for blockchains, land titles, mortgages, gun registries, anything that you can that you wish to keep track of in an anonymous fashion. And secure fashion, probably you could put on a distributed ledger.
And the key here is the trust, right? Again, it's not just simply about, well, now we have a new way of writing things down and sharing information. If that trust wasn't built in, you would just have a more elegant way of
wouldn't be
keeping
interesting. That's right.
The key to DLT and to blockchain is that trust. So, you know, even with land titles, you know, the number of mistakes actually on existing land titles. The slowness of, if anyone's done a residential real estate transaction recently, they'll be well aware of, you know, all the paperwork, the slowness. Even looking just the most basic use case, of course, is on the financial side. So, for example, how do I know I can write a check to Don and a check to somebody else?
Thank you.
Each for $100, and if that's all the money in my bank account, when somebody goes to cash it, whoever cashes it second is going to have a problem because I've tried to double spend that money.
Yeah.
And so the current solution might be, oh, well, I'll go to my bank, my third party, and I will get a bank draft or a certified check, and I'll pay money for basically a guarantee that that money is in my bank account. And as soon as I get that, that money comes out of my bank account. I can't spend that again.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the most elegant, modern, efficient solution. Certainly
Not
something
bad,
that's
though.
worked, but definitely not bad.
Yeah.
But that's another example
Yeah.
here. So smart contracts. Smart and contracts, is that a good name, Don?
No. I mean, I get why it's called that. Really, it's more of a self executing arrangement that is enabled by software. Let's put it that way. So normally when you do a transaction, let's say that you're buying something that's very, very expensive. Well, you might put the money in escrow. A third party that you trust holds it, and you pay for that service. When the transaction is completed, the money changes hands. Well, what's completing the transaction? That's checking certain documentation, making sure certain preconditions are satisfied, and so on and so on. Well, if you could program all that into a blockchain so that the conditions are automatically satisfied, or if they're not, of course, the transaction doesn't close. But assuming that you can track the satisfaction of conditions, the submission of documentation, proof, and so forth, then the money can be automatically released without any human intervention. Well, that's pretty good. And so essentially a smart contract can do that. Best example, which is the one I think that Nick Szabo thought of way back when, was the vending machine. You want to buy a can of your favorite soda pop. You put in a buck, and the soda pop comes out. No human intervention at all. That's in essence, a kind of a dumb smart contract.
And that's not exactly new technology. It's not as if anyone's going to be impressed by saying, "Oh, well, you can put money into a vending machine." So what's different here? What's different than the vending machine example?
Yeah, well, it's just the degree of complexity, the number of inputs. So if you can imagine, if you wanted to get and in fact, some vending machines work this way. You put in a buck, then you shake the machine, you bang on it a certain way. You kick it a certain way, and then the pop comes out. Well, you have to do all those things in the right order, and if you don't, you won't get your pop. So, it's just a more complicated way, essentially, of doing.
And again, I guess with a vending machine, you're trusting that when you put in that dollar, that you're getting a certain output. You haven't seen the code that's been in the vending machine to program it. Whereas here, correct me if I'm wrong, Don, that code is available, so you can see exactly. What's going to happen. Yeah. But that isn't straightforward, is it? It's not as if it's written in plain English or intuitive to the average person. So what does that mean then? Are there new people involved that you need to get involved, or is it just simply lawyers executing smart contracts on their own?
No, lawyers are not some lawyers are computer programmers, but majority are not. So for smart contract purposes, lawyers will probably need to engage the services of experts to build smart contracts for them. And of course, the smart contracts that do get built will be saved as scripts and whatnot, so that lawyers will do what lawyers always do, and that is, once something has been tried and tested, they'll simply use the same one over and over again for the same type of approach. Obviously, you have to change the names and whatnot.
So an example, let's say you run an ice cream business. You're running a business in Toronto, and you're worried, what's the weather going to be like this summer? Is it going to continue to be as glorious as it has been for the last month, or maybe the sun come out? And obviously, if you're in a business like that, your business is going to be pretty weather dependent, and you might decide to purchase insurance. You might say, well, maybe it's based on temperature. So maybe depending on the number of days in the summer that the weather is if it's below 20 degrees for too many days, you'll be compensated. So how do I do that without involving lots of human intervention? And one of the answers might be a smart contract. So you might have a contract. The agreement might be, if there's more than 30 days in the summer where the weather does not get above 20 degrees, then you'll be compensated. But who's that third party? How do we know what the weather was? And so the parties might use what we call an oracle. That's usually how I refer to Dawn. But an oracle in this case is a trusted third party. So you might use the Weather Network or the Weather Channel or one of those. And you might say, look, that's our guiding, that's where we're getting this information from. And we're going to go with that. And it will automatically tell us, based on how we build this, what the weather was. And it's really a question of if this, then that. So if the weather is below 20 degrees for X number of days, then something happens. In this case, then money will be paid from the insurance company to you without a need for human intervention in that process.
And it's automatic. Exactly.
It's automatic.
Yeah, exactly.
No paperwork, no submitting a claim. It all happens on its own.
Look, I'd like to get back to something.
Sure.
And that is the we started off by saying blockchain is just one of many kinds of distributed ledgers, and we've been concentrating a lot on the Bitcoin type of blockchain. But you know what? Getting back to this idea of consensus, there are other ways of getting consensus, and there's several distributed ledger systems that use a kind of gossip, if you will. The idea is, can we determine, when we look at a database, the provenance of any item of data? How can we make sure that it's correct? So if you refer to Tangle or Hashgraph or those kinds of distributed ledgers, what you find is that you can create a map anytime you want of the chain of information, and what passes from person to person is, let's say I give you some information and then you provide some information to somebody else. Well, that little triad there there are links between us, and we can demonstrate that I passed information to you and you passed it on. Well, there's also a triad where I'm the third item, and then there's a number 2 and a number 1, and that goes back right to the beginning of that particular datum. So that's the gossip, if you will, the gossip model for determining the correctness of any particular information. What's fun about that is that in terms of scalability, it's actually more scalable. Like, the more it's used, the more gossip there is, the more likely it is that you can look at the entire network of gossip that becomes a self-confirming set of information that allows you to say, yes, it's correct. Everybody saw that meteorite hit Lake Ontario. And we all tweeted about it at the same time. We were there. It must be true. So that's the basis, if you will, of a really good DLT system. And
it comes down to trust. So we've got a number of questions, and of course we're running low on time, about mining. And a couple thoughts. One, and Don, jump in any time. Wow. Not all of these blockchains or all these systems, or not all distributed ledger technology, and not all blockchains use mining. Mining is one way of building trust and building consensus, but certainly not the only way. And the second thing to point out is, if you look at the internet and you look at blockchain, I think blockchain is all about trust. It's that layer of this added trust. And if you look at how you use a computer and how you use the internet, you do things all the time without understanding how they work. I send an email to Don. I don't have a clue what happens behind the scenes.
I don't even know what's happening in front of the scenes. But yeah.
Do I understand TCP/IP and other things in depth about how to use a computer? Not at all. But I know that it works, and I can think about different ways I can leverage the internet and deal with the appropriate people to make these things happen. And it's the same idea with blockchain. If I send money, if I send Bitcoin to Don, I don't need to fully understand what happens behind the scenes. And I'm not seeing that. All I'm seeing is that I pressed a button, or Don gave me, I guess, his address in this case. Mm-hmm. I put that in, and the money transfers. I'm not seeing the entire mining process behind the scenes, but it's existing to verify the information, because down the road, that system, for example, is making sure that I actually have Bitcoin to transfer to Don. It's not simply assuming that I have them there. Yeah, so this is confusing.
So you have a religious belief too that it actually happens. Look, we're out of time. This has been great. I really have enjoyed this, and maybe we need to come back, in a few weeks and look at some of these discrete things. But in the meantime, time for everybody to go to work. We're really glad that you could join us today, and have a great rest of your week. Bye.
Thanks for joining us. Take care.